Okay, so we're going to begin with a story from my personal experience trying to use the technique of power mapping to solve a complex problem. In this case, problem of how to get a law passed. The, the story takes place in the year 2009. I was there this day in Washington, D.C. when Barack Obama was inaugurated as President of the United States. Very, very cold day, standing about 200 meters from where this picture was taken. And I was very excited because I had been hired by a new congressman named Jim Himes to work as a advisor and staffer within the House of Representatives, within one of the two branches of Congress. Nancy Pelosi had 3 years before been elected as Speaker of the House, the first woman to be in that position, very important position, the leader of this branch of Congress. And my boss, Jim Himes, had just been elected to Congress for the first time. He had a background in affordable housing, in banking, and he was coming to Capitol Hill for the first time as a newly elected member of Congress. A very smart guy looking to get things done. And I was a 29-year-old. Well, what can I say about me? I was a campaign organizer. I never worked on Capitol Hill prior to that, except for a summer job as a Capitol page running messages around the House of Representatives. But I never worked in a policy role in Congress, so this was a huge learning process for me. I was learning how do things really get done in Congress. Well, I had a big learning curve because several weeks after I started, we passed the largest law in American history, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, $787 billion to fight at that point what was a economy in crisis following the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, where had to learn about all kinds of things related to infrastructure and education, energy. There were lots of different provisions of this law. Followed shortly thereafter by the bailout of the American automobile industry, which had been hit terribly hard by crisis, another major event. And then the two big domestic priorities for Obama's first term. One was the fight against climate change and to lead an energy transition in America. Another to reform America's healthcare system. The climate change bill, led by Congressmen Henry Waxman and Ed Markey, passed the House in late June. I also have very fond memories of that day. It was a very close vote. Speaker Nancy Pelosi lost a lot of Democrats, but gained a sizable number of Republicans, and unthinkable today that Republicans would support fighting climate change, but she did it, and she passed this bill, unfortunately, to die later in the Senate. But that was a major moment in history. And at the same time, this health care bill begins to take shape. At this time, we had somewhere in the vicinity of 30, 40 million Americans without health insurance, and many with health insurance, but with very poor policies that wouldn't cover their needs. And so very urgent problem for America. And my role as a staffer was, as a freshman staffer, a first-term staff congressman, we didn't expect to play a big role in the substance of the law, but we're in a competitive district, meaning that if we don't get active and play a constructive role, even a small one, that doesn't look good, and we were in a district that had been represented by a Republican for many years, and we expected to have a strong competitor in 2 years' time. Congressmen run every 2 years for re-election. So my goal as a staffer for Jim Himes was to get an amendment to this larger bill with my boss's name on it. Something he could say, yes, this was my piece of the healthcare bill, something that I delivered in this bill to help the people in my district. I had no idea how to do it. This is a huge institution, U.S. Congress, And so that was my challenge. How do I get my boss's name on an amendment as part of this bill to get passed to save American healthcare? Big challenge. So my approach to power mapping came from my reading of history, and specific, an ancient Greek historian by the name of Polybius. He was a prisoner of war from a very educated family in Athens, and he had been taken prisoner when the Roman army was in the process of conquering Greece in the 2nd century BC. But he was a very high class prisoner of war, so he was kept under house arrest in a prominent Roman family. And he was, as many Greeks were, fascinated by how quickly this very marginal community of people, the Romans, who were not known for any great achievements, had conquered the entire world. How had they done that? And so Polybius set upon a project of understanding how the system of Roman society worked, and interviewing lots of people and reading lots of documents and trying to answer this question. What was it that was special about this group of people called the Romans that allowed them to create this enormous empire and take over much older, much more sophisticated cultures like Greece, as well as Egypt and Persia and Carthage and other places? So he writes this text we call the Histories, in which he explains to us the different institutions of the Roman Respublica, which is Latin for the public thing. We would think of it as their system of government, but it's bigger than government. It's their system of values, as well as elections, as well as religious and military institutions. And what he did that was innovative was he looked not only at what each institution did, but how each institution dealt with all of the others, what kind of powers they had versus all of the other institutions. And so, for example, every year there were elections, and the winners of these elections would serve in these different offices. The consuls were the top political and military officers. They would lead armies. They would administer the government in Rome. Underneath them were the praetors, who were judicial officials. Tribunes represented the will of the common people, and so on. These were each elected positions in Rome, and they had power over, life and death, over the force needed to make the government function day to day. But then you had the Senate, and each elected official, once you reached a certain grade in the hierarchy, would be automatically enrolled in the Senate and would be a senator for life. And the Senate was this continuous body of elders. It comes from the Roman word senex, meaning old person. And the Senate had the power of the money. So you see how they didn't have the power over ruling, armies day to day, but they had power over the treasury, and they had power over, we could call, the institutional health over time. They could legislate in the form of advice to the elected officials, but they didn't have direct power day to day. They had power over the money, but they were this continuous presence. And then finally, you had the people's assemblies, in which average Romans would meet in large groups to do the elections, but also to grant special honors, like the honor of a triumph, a big parade after a successful military campaign. And the assemblies also sat as juries in major cases of things like treason, public crimes against the state. So what Polybius figured out that no other ancient historian had really figured out before was that to understand a political system, it's not enough to understand what each individual role does. You have to understand how each of the powers depends on the others. And so he wrote in his histories the first account of what we call checks and balances. And his theory was that the checks and balances of the Roman system allowed these different institutions, these different people, to compete, but in a constructive way that made the system more energetic and more resilient than systems like monarchies or aristocracies. He also mapped how a single actor would change their function over time. The Romans had what they call the cursus honorum, in English, the path of honors. So one person, a young, ambitious Roman, would begin by doing military service in his late teens and then run for office. The lowest office would be the quaestor. There were many quaestors. They were kind of like aides, executive assistants, like what I was doing in Capitol Hill. And then they would, every year be competing with the people in their generation to make the higher office and higher office and higher office until the highest office of all was the office of consul. And Polybius again figured out that if you map how power evolves over time, you can see how this kind of highly competitive system can create greater resilience. So if people get killed in a battle, other people can rise up and take their place, as happened many times in Roman history. But when you have too many people competing for a fixed number of offices, this can raise the energy in the system until finally it can spill over into violence. And so you see both the notion of mapping actors and mapping processes. Now, Polybius didn't create these nice visualizations as I did, but he, using text, created maps of the Roman system to explain how and why Rome became so powerful. So we can, from Polybius and I think from our reading of history more recently, see a couple of principles of power mapping. The first is complex problems force us to be humble. We have to embrace uncertainty and stay constantly curious. Be honest about what we don't know and be realistic that we need to be constantly trying to get new sources of information. The second principle is we have to look beyond the surface. Don't be fooled by what the organogram or what the title on a business card says. You have to constantly be trying to understand how informal power works. Often informal power is just as impactful as formal structures of power, and how people interact in the system, who they know, who's friends with who doesn't like who is a cousin of who, is much more important to finding the right intervention than just looking at their status, their CV, their title. And finally, we have to constantly keep our maps fresh. So every time we're having a conversation, we want to update our map and compare notes on what we've learned from each new conversation, each new workshop. The goal is to use visualization to combine the intelligence of all the people on our team and an organization to constantly learn and be more powerful together than any of us can be alone. Okay, in our next to add to this notion of power mapping, what do we try to keep in mind when we're looking at power? So keep in mind that mapping is about prioritization, right? We don't want to map everything. You want to map the most important things that matter on our given issue at this given moment. So this will allow us to prioritize our resources, and often we don't have a lot of resources, so we want to really make smart choices. So how do we do that? How do we decide what to prioritize? Well, one way I propose is by thinking about four criteria, at least these four. There are others as well, but I use the acronym IAFA. So I is influence, A is accountability, F is favorability, and the other A is access. So we want to know, what is the unique kind of influence of each actor? How much influence do they have over the problem? Second, accountability. Who has to listen to who? Who has to report to who? Who cannot make a decision without checking with who? Or with whom, I should say. And how that works both informally and formally and informally. The third, favorability. How do they feel about this issue now? Are they interested? Or are they not interested? Are they engaged and favorable? Are they engaged and opposing? Those are important issues related to favorability and the engagement of the actor on the issue. And then finally, how do we access them? Can we just call them up and meet with them? Do we need to communicate with them through certain media? Do we need to make friends with someone in order to open a door to them? So access is the final consideration that we use when building our maps. And the goal, again, is to help us prioritize. If we try to pool all of our knowledge on these questions, it can help us choose the right place, the right time, and the right way to intervene in a positive way in the system. And as we've seen, we have three kinds of maps. Actor maps, in which we're usually, it's a good place to start. Who has influence? How do we reach them? And then you go back and forth between actor maps and process maps. Process maps, again, describe what is the sequence of steps in which something is decided or in which some behavior happens. Who has power at each phase? And then that helps us determine when is too early or too late to intervene. And finally, the most complex and interesting kind of map are systems maps, which use this notion of interconnection, dependency, and time together to show how actors influence each other in loops, in nonlinear ways, so that, or in reciprocal ways, so that we see how a system becomes more functional or more dysfunctional over time, or gets closer to our goal or farther away from our goal over time. And again, systems mapping, which we won't cover in this series, but it helps us answer the question about leverage. How do we find the right point with the highest leverage to make the change that we're hoping to make? And as I said, no map is ever finished. With wicked problems, we're constantly dealing with uncertain, volatile, ambiguous information, and so we want to keep updating the map over time. Okay, in the next video, I'm going to show you how I tried to apply these principles to this challenge of getting the health reform law passed in the U.S. Congress.